welcome back to All Things Special About Education. I am Shannon, the Executive Director at Kentucky IEP Advocate, and I am talking with Robyn Coleman today. Robyn is the owner of Full Spectrum Educational Consulting in Cincinnati. Can you share some more about yourself today?
Hey, Shannon. Yes, thank you. I love helping families and people succeed with, providing different types of consultation and evaluation. I also love spending time with my dog, Feta, my family and friends, and eating cheese.
Ooh,
Yeah.
we've never, in the times we've talked, we've never discussed a love for cheese. I could appreciate that. So just a little bit about how Robyn and I met. Robyn made an appointment. Did you schedule a consultation? I think she scheduled a consultation, and then I called to have the call, and I was like, you seem to be much more knowledgeable than most people I talk to, so tell me more about yourself, because you're asking some specific questions. So as I learned that she does school psychology testing in schools and then also has a consulting business, I started asking her questions. So here we are. One thing we talked about in our first meeting was people would really listen to this. This would be good. We should talk about this. So here we are talking about this because we should be. So let's get to what I'd like to talk about today. We have talked about evaluations, reevaluations, independent educational evaluations, and the one common word in all of these is evaluations. So one thing I would like you just to kind of start talking about is when you're looking at the consent to evaluate, when you're planning the evaluation, there's that general education or general intelligence section as part of that. So when that box has an X in it and an assessment is being done, tell us what that looks like.
What that looks like is a school psychologist, such as myself, would be doing a one-on-one IQ test with your student or with the person. So I would normally block out a portion of time, depending on the assessment that I give. It is anywhere from 30 minutes to sometimes upwards of close to 2 hours. But it's individualized, and it is what I would consider a standardized intelligence test. There are other intelligence assessments that are group based, that some people like to use for gifted assessments and things like that. But this is very specialized for this purposes.
So a school psychologist is doing the testing when you're at school, right? So then what are the qualifications? Because that's something that we also talked about in the independent educational evaluation discussion, was the district can tell you the qualifications of the person doing the independent educational evaluation. So the qualifications for somebody to do the IEE for general intelligence would be that they meet or exceed school psychology qualifications. So tell us a little about that.
So a school psychologist generally has one of two paths, well, maybe one of three. So we generally get our master's first, and then we'll have 2 additional years of education above that. So normally the practice school psychologists are called education specialists. And that means that we have 2 years of grad school with a full year of grad school and internship in a school building. And then there is a PhD route for generally those who like to do research and teach only. You don't see very many PhD school psychologists actually practicing in schools, but there are some. You could also have possibly a neuropsychologist or a clinical psychologist who has specific training in giving these types of assessments, doing those, but it is on the rare side.
Okay, yeah. And I think that's usually what parents have seen is the qualifications of somebody in the community if you are going to a neuropsychologist to get an independent educational evaluation. That language is different, so they're concerned like, ooh, does this person meet the qualifications? And it's that meet or exceed part that is different for that. Good. Another thing to discuss also is the never-ending list of acronyms that exist in this process, and I try so hard when I'm talking about it to say the letters, and then also like the admissions and release committee is ARC. So even, I'm sure you call it something different in Cincinnati. So, but in Kentucky, we call it the ARC team. So that's the meeting that you have about all of this. So what are the different acronyms that somebody can look for in that assessment so that you know what kind of scores you're looking at? You know, that's where people are going through. They're cruising through to just, you know, seek and find what they're looking for. And that's, you want an IQ score. It doesn't always say IQ.
Definitely. So the first assessment, the first thing you're going to find is the name of the test. So all the names of the tests are ridiculous. You have your Woodcock-Johnsons, your WISC, your WACE, your RIAS, your WNV, your, you know, all kinds of different stuff, your Stanford. So those will all have shorter acronyms, which may be referred throughout the assessment. So starting there. Then you're going to have your, oftentimes it's called FSIQ. So that's your full scale IQ. So that's the generally one number that combines all of the index scores. And as long as there are no significant discrepancies between the index scores, which significant means statistically significant, and that should be gone over if there is, then that score can generally represent what your overall IQ is. Then there are the different indices. They often have abbreviations themselves. So like the verbal comprehension index would be the VCI, the processing speed index, the PSI, the, you know, nonverbal index, NVI. You'll see things like that. And those all, again, if you have a decent evaluator, should list out at least one time the name of that index, explain it roughly, and then put your little brackets with the abbreviation around there. One score sometimes that you'll also see is called the GAI. And what that is the it is the full scale index with the working memory and the processing speed score removed. And sometimes we want to use that score if you have in a few circumstances. So if you have a student with a motor issue, so that, you know, they can't write very fast to begin with because of the difficulty with motor skills, or they have ADHD and they need a lot longer to process, so they're not able to copy code very well, because they need to take some breaks or they're distracted by every little thing that turns around. Or you have a couple of other reasons that might occur. One being gifted. So a lot of gifted students tend to have some anxiety regarding performing well. So even though you're supposed to do those types, the processing speed tasks pretty quickly, they might be worried about doing them more correct. So they want to do it slower. So that may not be accurate. So that's why you'd use that in that instance.
That makes sense. So when those scores can be like outliers, that isn't necessarily something that you would use to maybe consider bringing down or bringing up a score one way or the other if they're an outliers from all the rest of them. That makes sense. That makes sense, especially thinking about a standardized test is a standardized test because it's given in a standardized way. So, you know, there's only so much freedom you have in giving those types of tests. We didn't talk about this before, but now that we've brought that up, what are your thoughts on test setup as an accommodation for a test? Like, you know, obviously going to a place that is a quiet area so you have distractions minimized, that's best practice in general for any of us doing an assessment. But there is a lot of like discussion that happens like, well, but we couldn't, yeah, these are accommodations that the student gets otherwise, but we can't do that because this is a standardized test. But then that accommodation seems really reasonable. And that will get us to augmentative and alternative communication, which I do not believe is an accommodation. It is your voice and how you communicate to people. But sometimes that is interpreted as an accommodation for a standardized test. So what are your thoughts on accommodating during these tests?
There are certain things that, for example, I would accommodate as in giving a different test. So maybe a different
That
test
makes
that's
sense.
more appropriate for the population. So for example, I would not give a WISC-5 to a student with speech difficulties, to a student who has autism, to a student who, doesn't have English as their first language. I would do a nonverbal assessment. If a student has motor difficulties, I would do more of the verbal assessment piece. And note that I wouldn't necessarily accommodate, because the goal of giving a standardized test is to see where you are in the standardization profile, so that we can provide you accommodations to support and scaffold you to have better access.
So then a great question to ask when that comes up maybe isn't why didn't you provide these accommodations that my kid needs, but why are we only considering giving one test if that's not the appropriate test for my child?
Exactly.
Which then leads us right back to the IEE, which is what a huge part of all of this. Okay, thanks. Talk to us a little bit about what the IQ tells us. One thing that I am saying a lot on repeat, it feels like, is we're looking for scores that land between 85 and 115. We talked about the bell curve. And so even when I'm on the phone with people, I'm like drawing out the bell curve in the air as I'm talking, or, and we're talking about 100 right at the middle. But sometimes I feel like these aren't conversations that people are super comfortable having, because there is a ton of math on the back end of this, and nobody's trying to figure out the equation that got you the standard score. We just need to know why that standard score is important and how that is relative to a bell curve. Because when we talk about statistically significant scores, what are those?
So that's a great question. I think overall, the goal of an IQ test is to determine what services and supports are needed. But when we look at the scores, the reason they become relevant is, if you score one way or another. So talking about that, you have to have, as an examiner, you have to have a basic understanding of statistics. But you also have to be able to explain that in a way that is meaningful to parents, or parents are not going to be very kosher with the idea of you just presented them a score and it's in this range. So what that means is, I often bring out a normal curve or a bell curve, while parents are there. And if it's a parent who speaks another language, I try to have that curve printed in language that they understand, along with an interpreter. And I'll often mark, where on the curve that child or student falls. And I'll explain to them, the types of scores that come throughout the assessment. So, how it relates to their everyday life, which I don't know that every school psychologist got the wonderful training in that I did. And I wish that for everyone. But I understand that that's not the case. So, I think the IQ test tells, although it's supposed to tell how we process information and can provide predictions about things that will happen in the environment, what it really tells us is how well is this student going to do in a typical K-12 setting where your instruction is dictated to you 95% of the day. And so that's why a lot of these tests, the verbal weight is heavier. And so when you look at those scores, you need to be able to describe things. You need to be able to tell me how things are similar so that you can relate and pull your background information in. When you're processing information, I need to know when I'm doing these processing speed tests, I need to know if you're looking at the board, are you going to be able to copy notes down in a way that's quick enough for you to be able to understand the next thing that I'm going to say, or are you going to spend all of that time copying it down? If your working memory, your auditory or your visual working memory is not that great, I'm going to need to know, I have to come over and represent this material to you so that you can hear it another time. That kind of stuff. If you're nonverbal memory, if you're not great at recognizing patterns, we might need some additional support in math. We might need to provide you some graph paper so that you have that you have some extra skills. So all of that being said, our scores that we normally look at are around, depending on the state, 70 to 75 for what we call intellectual disability. It used to be called mental retardation, and so that is more people are more familiar with that term, but now we have to call it intellectual disability, cognitive disability, as a more appropriate term at this time. Now that has to be paired with adaptive skills that are commensurate to that score. So that means that if your daily living skills are not, rated roughly around that area as well, you can't be considered to have an intellectual disability. There may be something else going on. On the flip side, the technical definition for giftedness is 130 on an IQ. So, while we say 85 to 115 is within the average range, that's because 68% of the population falls within that range. So the majority of the population falls within that range. And what we generally work with in, special ed services or exceptional services is, kids on the very end. Now there's all kinds of things in between, but that's kind of what we're looking for, is to rule one way or the other out, and both can tell us so much. But even within that, 68%, if you're within that, you're going to know, like, hey, you have some strengths in this area, or you have some needs in this area, and here are some things that might be able to help.
I think that's one of the really valuable conversations to have when you're going over test scores as part of the team, when you're sitting at the ARC meeting, the admissions and release committee, when you're sitting there together and you're talking about eligibility, that sure, everybody's really focused on numbers, because when we fill out these eligibility forms, you have to, for so many of them, you have to meet these number requirements. But if you're not meeting that number requirement, that doesn't mean that there's no value in the rest of these scores. And that's the conversation of, this is what your working memory is. Need you to be able to do this task while also thinking about the next thing. Save this thing in so that you can use it. And like, as an OT, I'm constantly talking to people about visual processing and visual spatial relationships, as far as like fine motor, handwriting, reading. And it's not, and they're like, well, my kid did fine on the visual screen. And so now, but I'm seeing this thing over here on this test, and it's talking about visual processing. Yes, it is. You can see these things, but now what do we do with them? So being able to have those conversations about, like you said, reading at the board and writing it down, and knowing that like this information is different, the receiving and then the output here, that's just a different process. And that's such an important part about being a student, but also a super easy way to accommodate with guided notes.
Yep.
I mean, if that's hard, if this process is difficult, then instead of saying, well, you better get better at that, sure, provide some intervention to get better at that, but also give them some fill in the blank notes if you want them to learn.
Yeah.
And then also leading into, hopefully, what I also encourage people in as they're starting this process and you're looking at these assessment results, one thing we've talked about is checking every box or Xing every box on the consent to evaluate where you think there could be any sort of issue, while also recognizing that we're not only looking for the lowest of the low scores. Like, we also need the information. We have to know what you're good at. We've got to know if you can continue to have this conversation about a strengths-based approach where it's like, okay, yes, my working memory isn't great, but what I am really great at is this other thing. So let's really use that to support my working memory. And sometimes I think we find ourselves as providers, or certainly as parents, sitting in meetings where you get to this discussion of these, like, it's code, it's like a secret language, and you're like, so what does this even mean for my kid? And if the person who did the test isn't able to really explain it in a way that makes sense to a parent, then how also are they explaining it to make sense to the teacher who's doing this with, I mean, I want to say 20 kids, but we're really realistic in saying it's 30 kids these days in a classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you know what working memory means, so that tomorrow when you're sitting in class with this kid, what does that mean? And how do we use that strength, or how do we accommodate that skill deficit? So being able to have somebody with knowledge in the meaning, and then also being a parent who is comfortable saying, tell me more about that. Why is this important? What does that mean? how is that skill important at school? And then you can also think about at home, these are, when we're talking about like board and desk here, we're also talking about like menu at the fast food restaurant.
Yeah.
These are the real life things that you may see, which, like, connecting all those dots can help parents maybe understand the scores that they're seeing, where it's like, oh, okay, I didn't know that what you were talking about was the fact that the kid can't read the menu and then tell me what they want while we're standing at the register. And that's an important skill to have. Or we read the menu in the drive-through and we got to the window and they forgot where we were. Like, these are these skills that we're really, if you can connect that for a parent to really see what are we talking about and what does this look like, then maybe those scores do make a little more sense. But one thing I'd also like for us to talk about is how, how to disagree. You just say, I don't agree with this. So you're not describing the kid that lives at my house.
Yeah.
But how would you know? Because there's a lot of people that call me with some frustrations about, I know that my kid needs help with reading, but the school is saying there's not a problem, but also they're in the lowest reading group with the most intervention. It's not working, but they're not getting any services. They don't qualify. So can you help us understand a little better, like, when to know that you could disagree or what to disagree with?
So I think that definitely comes with arming yourself with knowledge. Every meeting that you get that is somewhere centered around some sort of special education activity, you should get a copy of your parents' rights. You should at least be offered that. And if you're not offered it, that's a different talking point to maybe call one of us
Yes.
about.
Yeah.
But but you should be offered it. And I would encourage every parent to look at it. I mean, I always say, like, it's boring stuff, but you never know when you're going to need to use it. In there, it explains it should explain, every category that your child might be eligible for and what the team should have been looking at. It explains your rights if you disagree and how to go about disagreeing. It explains, what your steps are. Now, oftentimes I say this to providers that I work with and people that I'm in meetings with all the time. We may do this 2 to 3 times a day, 2 to 3 times a week, but oftentimes the parent, this is their one shot and their experience with us. And research shows that the majority of the reasons why parents, are uncomfortable or they disagree or they feel, they're not connected to their provider team is because they don't feel a valued part of the team. And so, hopefully you would get that feeling and you would get someone to explain to you of, like, I don't necessarily agree. This doesn't sound like my kid, so that you feel comfortable saying that. And oftentimes my motto is like, hey, take it home, read it over. If you have questions afterwards, this doesn't stop here. The buck doesn't stop there. You still have a right to call those team members back together and say, hey, like, I read through this and it didn't sit well with me. You also have the right, even though people don't like it, you have the right to say, I'm not going to sign anything until I take it home. Because when you have a bunch of professionals who use all these acronyms, because we love acronyms, like, when you have all these people staring at you and this is your one time per year on the hot seat, like, I know if I didn't do this all the time, I would be nervous. So you are allowed to take it home and say, I'm not comfortable signing this until I get home. I'm in my peace and quiet space and I want to look through it and ask questions before I sign it. Because it is, we all have timelines. Most of us work up to the last minute of our timeline, but you are the parent and you are just, the parents are an equal member of the team. So that's what I would say. And honestly, if you don't feel comfortable, like your team heard you, like it's not your kid, I will say it brings me joy when the parent looks at me and says, wow, this is my kid. And that is my goal every single report that I do. And if it doesn't turn out that way, which I've never had anybody say that out loud, except for, maybe a gifted assessment where somebody didn't think they were, high enough IQ or something like that. But then that's your shot of, hey, this didn't sit right, or they didn't explain this well enough to me. Feel free to call an advocate. Feel free to call someone to do an IEE, because even if you agree at the time, you're still entitled to one IEE every evaluation, and there often is no time limit to that.
Yeah,
So
one thing that we talked about before was, while there's not a time limit, even, I will review documents and they're from 2 years ago because that's the most recent testing. So if we're looking at this and we're like, okay, so here, this is why you're not seeing anything academic on here, because they didn't do any academic tests, so they don't have any academic data to say this is a skill deficit and we need to address it. So that's definitely something where it's like, or they did the academic tests and they don't actually look like really what you're seeing in the classroom, but they just moved forward with it. And I think when you're getting close to that 3-year reevaluation, a lot of times districts are like, let's just do the 3-year early, give us a crack at it and let us try it. And a lot of times when that happens, although parents are like, I didn't like the first one, I'm not going to like this one, there's a lot to be said when they know that your next step is to ask them to pay to go somewhere else. That, not that the first test wasn't done seriously, but this one's going to be really closely looked at to make sure that they're giving you accurate assessment results, so that they're not paying again. They're already paying this person to do the assessment, they won't pay again.
yeah,
But I think that's kind of been the time that I have seen it, where it's just like, we're getting ready to do another one, so let's do that early. And then if you disagree with that, we'll move forward and do what we're doing next. But for the most part, it's difficult to come up with a time where they're just not necessarily, I mean, the delayed response time can kind of drag some things out sometimes, and that happens not just with an independent educational evaluation, but it happens with a lot of things. If they know you're asking for something that they're not prepared to do in the moment, then it's
yeah,
just like, I'll get to that. And that is not a school thing, that's an anybody thing. That's, I don't want to have this conversation, so I'm probably not going to call you back today. Like that.
yes,
That's just how humans work. And so we can expect that of course is how it's going to work here. All right, I think that we have covered a lot
yeah,
here. I would like to just kind of allude to maybe a future conversation. Something that is paired a lot together with general intelligence testing is that academic performance testing. And that is testing that you as a school psychologist would do, or an independent educational evaluation would do, so we can compare those scores.
yeah.
I don't want to get into that now because that's it's going to be another 30 minutes, and I wanted to keep this to 30 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
So we will follow up about academic performance testing, because that's in the top right corner of the consent to evaluate. So we can talk about what those tests look like and how you compare them. But thanks for all the information on general intelligence and IQ. I hope that people have a better understanding, or at least enough information now to feel good about going to a team and asking questions. And just to highlight something we have talked about before is, if you just don't get that good feeling about the way somebody is presenting these test scores, like they're not able to explain them to you. They're not, and it's not that they're choosing not to. It really is like, you got to stand behind your test scores and explain them. And if you're sitting at a table with somebody who cannot do that, that is an indicator of getting a second opinion, because you need to make sure that these test scores are reliable so that you can make accurate educational decisions that really actually support the student in progressing in school. So where can people find more information about you, and maybe tell us a little bit about the full spectrum educational consulting business
Yeah,
that you have?
I work with both districts and families, so I can conduct an IEE. I can just do, I specialize in autism assessments and assessments of multilingual learners. I also work a lot with dyslexia and systems change. So my website is fullspectrumec.com, and then my email is FSEConsultants@gmail.com. So
Awesome.
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Thanks for all of the really great information, and look forward to talking to you again about our next topic.
Absolutely.